Welcome, everyone, to tonight's virtual talk, part of an ongoing series from the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library that connects writers, historians, and TR scholars with audiences from around the globe, whether you're a lifelong TED head or someone swinging by to learn something new. I'm Marcy Whale, Manager of Public Programs and Education here at the TRPL, and tonight it is my privilege to be joined by Jeffrey Rosen. As always, I am happy to share that tonight's program is as interactive as ever. If you have a question for Mr. Rosen throughout tonight's program, please leave a comment in the chat and we'll return to those during our Q&A. Now, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest. Jeffrey Rosen is the CEO Emeritus of the National Constitution Center, a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School, and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor of The New Republic and a staff writer for The New Yorker. Rosen is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Pursuit of Happiness and Conversations with RBG. His new book is The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Rosen is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School. He is an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Law Institute. In 2024, the French government recognized him as a Chevalier in the Order of Arts and Letters. With that, Mr. Rosen, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. And it is an honor to be here. Because this is the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, let me begin by saying that it was a Theodore Roosevelt connection that inspired me to write a book about Hamilton and Jefferson and their influence throughout American history. I spent more than 2 decades as the legal affairs editor of the New Republic magazine, as you said. And during that time, I read a book by the founder of the New Republic called The Promise of American Life. It was by Herbert Croly. And in this book, Croly called on Theodore Roosevelt during the 1912 campaign to adopt Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. In other words, the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power for the Jeffersonian ends of curbing the corporations and promoting democracy. And TR embraced this challenge nearly word for word. He said, I am a Hamiltonian on questions of federal power and a Jeffersonian on questions of democracy. And he resolved in his new nationalism to combine the philosophies of Hamilton and Jefferson. I thought that was interesting. And then I wondered whether anyone else had written a book tracing the influence of Hamilton and Jefferson throughout history. I found that there was a famous book, Jefferson versus Hamilton, The Battle for Democracy Over Aristocracy, that ignited FDR's New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt read this. It only dealt with the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson in their own times, but he was so struck by the exaltation of Jefferson as the Democrat fighting against the elitist Hamilton that he wrote the only blurb he ever wrote for any book in his life. He invited the author Claude Bowers to speak at the 1928 Democratic Convention. And when he won the presidency in 1932, he decided to make Jefferson the patron saint of the New Deal. Now, friends, this is an act that can only be described as what my people would call chutzpah, because FDR, of course, was expanding the size of the federal government in ways that would have made the libertarian sage of Monticello cringe. But FDR emphasized the democratic rather than the libertarian Jefferson, and he put Jefferson on the nickel, and he built the Jefferson Memorial, and he was all Jefferson all the time. In fact, he died days before Jefferson's birthday, with an undelivered speech on Jefferson as the prophet of the post-war era. And then I found after that Ronald Reagan said that he left the Democratic Party in 1960 because it had abandoned the principles of Hamilton and Jefferson. So I just thought, has anyone actually taken the story all the way up? And I found that no one had. There are, of course, many, many books about the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson in their own time. There are early political histories, in particular by John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren, tracing the rise of the Federalist and Democratic Republican Party back to the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson, although Adams and Van Buren disagreed about what aspect of that battle was central. For Adams, it was their battle between national power and states' rights, and for Van Buren, the battle between democracy and rule by elites. So it was a topic that just seemed to be hiding in plain sight. Of course, we're all familiar from civics, from high school, that Hamilton and Jefferson fought, but I thought it might be useful to tell the story from the beginning, to reconstruct their central clash of ideas, in particular, the battle between national power and states' rights, between democracy and rule by elites, between executive power and congressional power, and between liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution, and take it all the way up from the beginning to today on the occasion of America's 250th. And it was just the most exciting topic. Of course, it's a marvelous time to be a historian. So many of the sources are online and electronically searchable. And just by putting the words Hamilton and Jefferson into the search engines, I found that they're referenced everywhere by name, by presidents and Supreme Court justices and politicians and ordinary Americans. And their ideas are so influential that they're like golden and silver threads woven throughout the tapestry of American history. That's the image that came to my mind. Sometimes they cross, sometimes they pull apart, sometimes so far apart that they threaten to snap. But it's the productive tension on both sides of the thread that has prevented America from descending into violence. And on the rare occasions when thinkers or parties have rejected the ideals of Hamilton and Jefferson entirely, such as the defenders of slavery who dismissed the Declaration as a glittering generality or a self-evident lie before and during the Civil War, that's when the shooting has begun. So in other words, Hamilton and Jefferson agreed about the basic principles of the American idea as embodied in the Declaration: liberty, equality, and government by consent, but they disagreed about how to balance those values. In particular, along the lines that I mentioned: national power versus states' rights, executive power versus congressional power, and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution, and democracy versus rule by elites. The book begins with a scene. Of course, you've got to tell stories to make history exciting, and because it is so exciting. And I call it the dinner party that defined America. And it takes place in the room where it happened, not the one in the musical where Hamilton and Jefferson agree to move the capital from New York to DC in exchange for assuming the national debt. This is a year later. It's also in the same room of Jefferson's house on Maiden Lane in New York City. But this time the topic is different. Washington is away and the cabinet is gathered. At some point in the evening, Hamilton looks around the room and says, "Who are those three guys on the wall, the three portraits?" And Jefferson says, "Those are my three visions of the greatest men in history: John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." And Hamilton pauses for a long time, and then he blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson later records, "This proves that Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but for a monarchy bottomed on corruption." And he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in supposed opposition to the monarchism and Caesarism of Hamilton and the Federalists. Now, in some sense, this is the greatest opposition research slogan in history, because on one level, Hamilton was almost certainly joking. He feared Caesarism, but he feared the Caesar-like demagogue who would come from below rather than above, would flatter the people and persuade them to exchange their liberties for cheap luxuries, for bread and circuses, and install himself as a dictator. He wrote in Federalist 21, "Imagine that Shays' Rebellion, the uprising of debtors in Western Massachusetts, had been led by a Caesar or a Catiline. The Republic might have been strangled in its cradle." Hamilton's solution to the problem of a Caesar-like demagogue is a life term for the president. That's what he proposed in his infamous speech at the Constitutional Convention, which lasted 6 hours. And he said that a president elected for life would be liberated to look to the public interest rather than to parochial or party interests, and to tend to the public good. His model was the British king. He thought the British Constitution nearly perfect. He always insisted that he was opposed to hereditary monarchy, and in that sense, he was a Republican, but he did like the idea of a life term for the president. It didn't go over very well, but it wasn't completely out of the blue, other Federalists, including Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson, also toyed with the idea of a life term for the president. So it was in the air. Jefferson fears Caesarism from the opposite direction. He imagines a Caesar-like demagogue who will cross the Rubicon, persuade the Senate to surrender its prerogatives, and install himself as a military dictator for life. When he gets a copy of the Constitution, Jefferson writes to Madison, he has two objections. First, there's no Bill of Rights. And second, the president is eligible for re-election because there are no term limits, which is Jefferson's solution to the problem of the demagogue. Jefferson fears that a future president might, in Jefferson's words, lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states that had voted for him to support him, and refuse to leave office. So Jefferson has the opposite proposal, a one-year term limit. Hamilton wants a life term. In the end, there's no term limits imposed. Washington creates the precedent of a two-term presidency, which Jefferson keeps. It holds until TR, our hero this evening, runs for a third term, although Grant had contemplated it. He never actually ran. And TR loses, of course, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected to a third and then a fourth term. Franklin Roosevelt is attacked so often as a Caesar during his presidency that he dresses up like Julius Caesar in 1934 with a laurel crown and a toga, with Eleanor, his wife, dressed as a Roman matron. And he makes fun of the charges, but they're serious enough that after his death, right before Jefferson's birthday, Congress proposes and the states ratify the 22nd Amendment, which forbids presidents from running for more than, or rather, it forbids them, to be precise, from being twice elected to the office of presidency. And that tradition has held ever since then. So that's the opening debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about the nature of executive power. And in theory, Jefferson favors a constrained executive and Hamilton a very vigorous one. It has to do with their different attitudes toward liberty and power. For Jefferson, every increase in power threatens liberty. For Hamilton, increases in power can secure liberty. This may have come from their childhood. So much of our characters, of course, comes from our mom and dad. I describe how Jefferson always romanticized the Saxon past. He had an obsession with the idea that in the ancient days of the Saxon and the Celts living in wodes and wards before the Norman conquest, self-governing Britons were able to have proto-democracies and decide things by majority vote and rule themselves. And he thought that all this was destroyed by the Norman conquest, which imposed feudalism and entrails on property. And he's always yearning to return to the idyllic vision of the Saxon past. Where did he get this preference for kind of utopian, idealized, rose-colored glasses? Hard to say. His childhood seems to have been, there seems to have been some basic insecurity. He worshipped his father, Peter Jefferson, who died when he was 14. On Peter Jefferson's death, Jefferson wrote in his commonplace book a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, which he believed was the central definition of happiness, meaning being good rather than feeling good, the pursuit of virtue rather than pleasure. And his relationship with his mother seems to have been more ambivalent. He rarely mentions her in his writings, even though he lived with her until his late into his 20s. Perhaps they were estranged. He has misogynistic passages in his commonplace book. Hard to say because there's not much of a record. But some basic insecurity led him constantly to idealize lost utopias. And he tries to create at Monticello an idyll of the self-governing community, blind to the central hypocrisy of the fact that the people who surrounded him, who he called his family, were in fact his enslaved population, and the enslaved people who served him in his own house were his own kids, by Sally Hemings. So there's a very dramatic clash between his image of himself as the benign, paternalistic father of this utopian idyll and the brutal reality of enslaving plantation that had to be sold on his death because he was so in debt, despite the fact that he believed that no generation should be able to pass on a debt to another, and that there should be a constitutional convention every 19 years to avoid the dead hand of the past. Still, he was so broke because of his Caligulan spending. He was a shopaholic, that the entire estate had to be sold, parents separated from children, and he only freed his own children by Hemmings and a few of their relatives, no one else. Basically, Jefferson was a Whig, call him a libertarian, really. I think liberal is not right in the progressive sense, but he worshiped Lord Coke and Parliament and believed that every incursion on parliamentary prerogatives by the king threatened liberty. And most of all, he favors states' rights and government on the smallest possible level. Hamilton has a very different upbringing. As we know from the musical, John Adams accused him of being the son of a Scotch bastard and a whore. He was very embarrassed by his illegitimacy, constantly picking fights with those who insulted him, both his friends and his enemies. And it's surprising that we can understand why he picked fights with Jefferson and Aaron Burr and eventually Madison, but he also picks fights with John Adams, the president who is running for election in 1800, writes a kind of crazed screed against Adams for no particular reason, except for his own wounded pride. And he also even has a falling out with George Washington, his mentor, who he keeps waiting briefly on the stairs because he's doing an errand. Washington gently criticizes him. Hamilton says, "If that's the way you feel, sir, we must part." And Washington has to basically implore him to come back several months later. So he's a hothead. He's the reason that he got the musical. There's no musical about Jefferson, who is so much more Sphinx-like and opaque, feline, almost feminine in according to the historian Henry Adams, in his capacity for concealing realities even from himself. Like a Chinese box, he compartmentalized his life. But Hamilton is all out there, driven by his desire to inscribe himself like a sunbeam on the American history. He has ambition, he yearns for fame in the classical sense, and of course he achieves it through his meteoric rise on St. Croix, where he writes this essay denouncing, or rather describing, a hurricane, which is so vivid that local businessmen take up a collection, send him to America to be educated, eventually at King's College. Ron Chernow writes in his biography, Hamilton didn't realize it, but he'd just written his way out of poverty. And Lin-Manuel Miranda later said that was the sentence in the biography that convinced him to write the musical. He thought it was so vivid. And in the process, of course, Lin-Manuel Miranda transformed Hamilton from the aristocratic monocrat or Caesarist, the would-be aristocrat of Jefferson's day, into the rapping, self-made immigrant champion of the American dream, which is quite a hat trick of reinvention, because when the musical, or when Chernow wrote the biography, Hamilton's stock was very low, and Chernow wanted to resurrect him. And then, of course, the musical made him an international superstar. But it just shows how when the stock of Jefferson goes up, that of Hamilton goes down, and vice versa. When Hamilton dies in the duel, he's forgotten and the Federalist Party is finished and everyone's a Jeffersonian. Lincoln stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861 and says, "I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration of Independence and the works of Jefferson. I'd rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon the principles of Jefferson and the Declaration." Then the war came, and the war came, as Lincoln so memorably said. And after the war, it's Jefferson who is reviled as the prophet of secession and nullification. And President Grant banishes a statue of Jefferson, which President Polk had brought to the White House, back to the Capitol, to the basement. A statue of Hamilton is installed in the rotunda, and everyone's a Hamiltonian. And James Garfield and John Bingham make Hamilton the patron saint of Reconstruction and expanded federal power. Then there's that crucial election of 1912, and I've already described the view of our hero, Theodore Roosevelt, Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. But it's striking that the other two candidates are Hamiltonians as well. You'd think that Woodrow Wilson would be a Jeffersonian, given the fact that he's a Southern Democrat, the patron saint of the Democratic Party. But he rejects the separation of powers, thinks the British Constitution perfect, and prefers a kind of president as a prime minister ruling in Parliament, as a kind of king in Parliament. And he has always admired Hamilton and Hegel since his student days. And William Howard Taft, another great hero of mine, I wrote a short biography of him and his breakup with Roosevelt, loves Hamilton because he views both Wilson and Roosevelt as demagogues who are insisting for the first time that the president is a steward of the people who can directly channel popular will. This appalls Taft, who views the president as a kind of chief magistrate who should execute Congress's will, the vision that Jefferson embraced in theory but totally betrayed in practice once he became president. And Taft runs to defend judicial independence and the rule of law. He doesn't want to be president. His wife and Theodore Roosevelt had made him do it, basically. He yearns to be Chief Justice, a goal he eventually achieves. But he is very disturbed by the transformation of the presidency into what Arthur Schlesinger called the imperial presidency. And if we want to locate a moment when the imperial presidency arose, one good date would be 1912, and the two culprits would be both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Interesting, isn't it, that the Democrat and the Republican worship Hamilton, and through the new nationalism and the new freedom, they expand the presidency. Now, there are some important differences between Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft. Behind me is one of my other heroes, Louis Brandeis, Wilson's chief legal advisor, who he appointed to the Supreme Court. And Brandeis was a Jeffersonian to his core. He believed in, like Jefferson, he denounced what he called the curse of bigness in business and government. And he wanted government at the smallest possible level, in particular that he preferred states' rights to a strong federal government. He constructed the administrative state as a kind of decentralized combination of public and private ownership. And he advised Wilson to break up the trusts so they could be regulated by the states. Theodore Roosevelt wants to create a bureau of corporations that's strong enough to regulate the trusts from the top down. And Taft, that old defender of the rule of law, wants strong antitrust enforcement. And he brings more antitrust suits in his one term than Roosevelt does in two. So Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster may be overstated, given the fact that the judicious Taft was even more determined. But those three visions of federal power basically are channeling some of the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson. And in that regard, Wilson is Jeffersonian in his preference for decentralized power at the state level, although he wants the president to be a Hamiltonian president. And Theodore Roosevelt in his preference for top-down regulation. And Brandeis then goes on to write the greatest free speech opinion in all of Supreme Court history. And he's channeling Jefferson word for word. He's just read Jefferson's Virginia Bill on Religious Freedom over the summer of 1926. And in the Whitney versus California case, he says in immortal words, which I think I can recite from memory as a party trick, because I've done it a few times. I'll do it because it gives you the essence of the Jeffersonian view of free speech, which is made immortal by Brandeis. Brandeis wrote in Whitney, "Those who won our revolution believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty." That's a quotation from Pericles' funeral oration. "They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government." Immortal, beautiful words, and they expressed this transcendent faith in reason and deliberation and the need to hear competing points of view. Jefferson, quoting Milton, had said, "Truth has nothing to fear from error as long as reason is free to combat it." And Brandeis said, quoting Isaiah, "Let us reason together." FDR would call Brandeis Old Isaiah because he was like an Old Testament prophet, and was shocked when Brandeis joined a unanimous Supreme Court in striking down aspects of the first New Deal. Even Old Isaiah, FDR asked his advisors. Yes, he too joined the majority. It's because Brandeis thought that the first New Deal was too centralized, and he called Tommy Corcoran and other FDR advisors to his austere apartment on California Street in D.C. and said, "Tell the president to stop this business of centralization. If he doesn't stop it, we, the court, will stop it for him." And that's exactly what the court did. If the first New Deal breathed the spirit of Hamilton and centralization, said Arthur Schlesinger, the second New Deal breathed the spirit of Jefferson and decentralization, and that was somewhat the case. The central question on the constitutionality of the New Deal turned on the construction of a single word in the Constitution, necessary, and that debate goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson. And now I'll tell you about their fundamental constitutional debate about the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, which is the most important constitutional debate in American history and has defined our battles ever since. As soon as Hamilton becomes Secretary of the Treasury, he proposes the assumption of the state debts and a Bank of the United States to ensure that foreign creditors will have confidence in the new republic and will have an international ability to circulate currency and to lend and borrow. Jefferson argues that the bank is unconstitutional. Washington asked for memos on the question, as he always does. He likes competing points of view. Jefferson's memo says the bank is unconstitutional because the Constitution authorizes Congress to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying its powers, its enumerated powers, into effect. And he wants to construe the word necessary to mean absolutely or indubitably or unquestionably necessary. And since a bank isn't absolutely necessary to achieve the enumerated powers of promoting the general welfare or levying taxes, Jefferson says we shouldn't imply the power to charter the bank. Hamilton disagrees. He stays up all night. He writes 14,000 words. And in his memo, he says the word necessary should be construed to mean appropriate or useful or conducive. And because a bank might be appropriate, useful, or conducive to achieving the enumerated powers of taxation and the general welfare, Hamilton wants to imply the power to charter the bank, even though it's not enumerated in the Constitution. So you see the basic difference between Hamilton and Jefferson is the difference between liberal and strict construction and a willingness to imply powers that are not enumerated. The case goes up to the Supreme Court after Hamilton falls in the duel. Chief Justice Marshall cordially detests Jefferson, a distant cousin, and views himself as the incarnation of Hamilton. Marshall has all sorts of wonderful insults for Jefferson. He calls him the great Lama of the mountain. Not clear what that means, but maybe looking down like a llama at Monticello. And he worships Hamilton, with whom he served at Valley Forge, and wants to carry on Hamilton's ideas once he's on the bench as a kind of Federalist redoubt. He has beside him, as he's writing the Macaulay and Maryland opinion, Hamilton's memo, because he's writing Washington's biography. Bushrod Washington, Washington's nephew, has given him Washington's papers, which include the memos. And he paraphrases Hamilton's memos almost word for word in one of the most famous sentences in American constitutional law: "Let the end be legitimate, and any means that are appropriate for carrying it into effect can be implied," more or less. Marshall's paraphrase is more direct than mine. And that sentence and that construction of the word necessary defines all of our constitutional battles ever since. It defines the battles over whether or not the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery north of the 38th parallel, is constitutional. Jefferson had initially said that Congress could ban slavery in the territories in the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. But by the time the Missouri Compromise is passed in 1820, he's become much more attached to defending slavery, although he always insists that it should end at some point in the distant future, which keeps receding in the horizon. And suddenly he wants to construe the word necessary strictly, and also to construe the territories clause of the Constitution strictly. In the Northwest Ordinance, he had said that Congress could acquire territories that were not part of the Union when the Constitution was ratified, or the Articles of Confederation in that case. Suddenly, in the case of the Missouri Compromise, he says you can only regulate territories that were part of the Union when the Constitution was drafted. As it happens, this is the opposite of the construction that Jefferson embraced when he decided to double the size of the United States and buy Louisiana. He gets this incredible chance to buy Louisiana for $15,000 or so when Napoleon says, I renounce Louisiana, because he wants to focus on his Russian wars. Jefferson wants to buy it and double the size of the United States. There's just one problem. He thinks it's unconstitutional. He has no power to do so because of his strict construction of the Territories Clause. But after briefly contemplating a constitutional amendment, he says, never mind, and buys Louisiana despite his doubts about its constitutionality, showing his flexibility, which is characteristic of his performance in office. He becomes much more devoted to presidential power in office than out of it. In the Dred Scott decision, a concurring justice, Justice Campbell, notes that Justice Taney has embraced Jefferson's strict construction of the Territories Clause, and if the Louisiana Compromise, if the Northwest Ordinance is, please forgive me, if the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, so is the Louisiana Purchase. I know the details are technical, but it just shows us how people are constantly flipping back and forth in order to reach predetermined results. The same question was during the New Deal. It was a question under the Necessary and Proper Clause, whether certain aspects of the New Deal were constitutional. And today, many of our constitutional battles, including that over the constitutionality of Obamacare, also go back to the Necessary and Proper Clause. Does this mean the fact that Supreme Court justices are constantly switching back and forth in their constitutional philosophies, that law fails to constrain? No, Hamilton and Jefferson may have betrayed their principles like their successors, but they gave America the gift of principles to betray. And it's significant that on the current Supreme Court, there's a division, even among the conservatives, about who's a Hamiltonian and who's a Jeffersonian. When Justice Antonin Scalia was appointed, he called himself a Hamiltonian and favored broad deference to federal administrative agencies, and disagreed with Justice Clarence Thomas about the constitutionality of federal laws regulating medical marijuana. Justice Thomas considers himself a Jeffersonian. He just recently gave a speech about the Declaration of Independence. He's a strict constructionist and has a much more limited view of federal power than Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia said of Thomas, he would overturn any law he believed was inconsistent with the original understanding of the Constitution. I wouldn't do that because I'm not a nut. He said that affectionately of his friend, Justice Thomas. On the current court, I would say that Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett, and Justice Kavanaugh are arguably Hamiltonian in their review of congressional power, whereas Justices Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito are Jeffersonian in their views of congressional power. But when it comes to executive power, the parties flip, and the Republican conservatives tend to be proponents of the unitary executive theory, a phrase that comes from Hamilton in the Pacificus Letters and favors a very broad vision of executive power. And it's the Democrats all of a sudden who are Jeffersonian in demanding the limited executive, at least when a Republican is in office, and they tend to take a much more broad Hamiltonian view of congressional power. Far from viewing this as a sign that law is completely politics, I take from it the lesson, first, that the court has been quite political for much of its history. And we see just after the Civil War, the main constitutional question was whether or not Congress could print paper money in the Gold Clause cases. Lincoln wanted to appoint justices who would uphold his power to do that since it financed the Civil War. He's martyred. Congress reduces the size of the court by 2 seats to deny Andrew Johnson the ability to make appointments. It then restores those 2 seats. The court strikes down the power to print paper money. Grant appoints 2 justices, and just a few months later, the court reverses itself and upholds the power to print paper money. The dissenting justices say this is pure politics. The only thing that's changed is the composition of the court. And it sounds a lot like the dissent in Dobbs in the Dobbs abortion case overturning Roe v. Wade. So it may have really been just a relatively brief period in the post-war period where there was a relative bipartisan consensus when the court was relatively moderate and the swing Justices O'Connor and Kennedy, were keeping it from polarizing too far one side or the other. So we may be returning to a historical norm. Nevertheless, I am inspired by the fact that although there is plenty of flip-flopping, Hamilton and Jefferson are always referred to, and our presidents and our justices have been such deep students of history, starting with Theodore Roosevelt, our hero for the evening. Remember that amazing letter that he sent to the president of Columbia describing the, I don't know what it was, 200 books that he'd read during his first few months in the White House, including Herodotus, and half of the books are in French, and the classics. And it's just a remarkable reminder of what a reader he was. And of course, he had a special leather case made for his books and leather bindings for the books so that he could take them on safari. And he wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris at the suggestion of his friend Henry Cabot Lodge, who'd written a biography of Hamilton. And Roosevelt also reads Gertrude Atherton's The Conqueror, which is a fictionalized version of Hamilton, with the kind of Hamilton musical of its day, and turns Hamilton into a big hero. So Roosevelt is an inspiring reader, but when you think about all of our presidents, starting from the beginning, I was impressed by how many of them are deep readers. And because this is a history show, I'll share that I would say here are the following presidents who actually read primary source documents from the letters of Hamilton and Jefferson and their collected papers. John Quincy Adams and Van Buren, who wrote those political histories. Lincoln, who went to the Springfield Law Library and read the records of the Constitutional Convention, as well as original works of Jefferson that had been published. Grant, who read the collected works of Hamilton that had just been published. All three candidates in 1912. Roosevelt and Wilson and Taft all wrote books about Hamilton, in fact. Remarkable, isn't that? Astonishing. And then we have come into the modern era. Coolidge was a great fan of Hamilton, and he worshiped him based on his studies at Amherst College. Franklin Roosevelt was a reader who was inspired by the Jefferson Franklin Hamilton biography. And then we have Truman, who was such an autodidact that he could quote Jefferson's letters from memory. And he did that with Justice Hugo Black, who was another great Jeffersonian. And then we have JFK, who had the best single one-liner about Jefferson that anyone's ever come up with. You know it, of course. At a gathering of Nobel Prize winners in the White House, he said, "This is the greatest collection of talent at the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone." And he was a reader and wrote some books with the help of Theodore Roosevelt, of Ted Sorensen, but was definitely loved history. And then we come further into the modern era, and we have Nixon, who famously said, "I may not be educated, but I do read books." And he did, and he was thought about resisting subpoenas in the tradition of Jefferson during Watergate because he was so well read in Jeffersoniana. And then we have President Clinton, who is such a devotee of his namesake, William Jefferson Clinton, that he takes a bus from Monticello to his inauguration, and he declares the big government is over, and he views himself as a Jeffersonian Democrat through and through. And George W. Bush reads deeply, read the Hamilton biography and recommended it. And of course, President Obama read the Hamilton biography, previewed the musical at the White House Poetry Jam, quoted Hamilton in his Cooper Union speech, and stakes healthcare reform on his vision of Hamilton. So it's a pretty impressive group of readers we have. And we tend to dismiss our presidents as partisans, but when I think about how deeply they engaged with the ideas of Hamilton and Jefferson, I'm inspired. I'll close by noting that although Hamilton and Jefferson were deep political rivals, they converged in their enmity for Aaron Burr. "If we have an embryo Caesar, 'tis Burr," Hamilton said. And he sides with Jefferson over Burr in the election of 1800, persuading Federalists to cast the decisive vote. because although he doesn't like Jefferson, he thinks Burr is a traitor who's conspiring to lead a secessionist movement in Spanish Louisiana and set himself up as dictator of Mexico. And he proves to be right, as subsequent evidence will reveal. And he, in other words, sacrifices his life nobly because he's a devotee of the Union and he thinks Burr is a traitor. And Jefferson reciprocates the respect by placing a bust of Hamilton across from his own in the central entrance hall of Monticello. And when he's old, he will smile faintly and say, opposed in life as in death. And for Jefferson, Hamilton is not a hated enemy to be opposed, but a respected opponent to be engaged with. And that's just the spirit that we have to get back to today. Thank you so much. And I'd love to take your questions and have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rosen, for those wonderful remarks, thoughtful from beginning to end. And I will begin our Q&A with a very sort of simple question, allowing you to guide the direction we begin. Would you prefer to start with a cultural, legal, or philosophical question?
I will leave it to you, whatever you think is most interesting.
Okay, because I thought I heard the semblance of a Nixon impersonation slip into your list of well-read presidents, I'd like to begin with a sort of open-ended one there. You're listing everybody from John Quincy Adams to Obama. Was there someone in their engagement with those primary sources that you either found most faithful and sort of idealistic and admirable in that way, or rather most interesting and stand out in their engagement with those primary source works? I'll let you take it either way.
Thank you so much. Thanks for noticing the Nixon impersonation. I really shouldn't do this, but I'm going to give you my Theodore Roosevelt impersonation because you can hear it on really early gramophone records. And there's this hearing of Mr. Archibald of the Standard Oil Company, who accuses Roosevelt of giving him the Abyssinian treatment. And Roosevelt, in this very screechy high voice with the bad sound, says, "I did give him the Abyssinian treatment. I will give it again and again." It's amazing.
Oh, no.
Definitely got to get it into the library. The greatest intellectual, aside, I would say, and the one who engaged most deeply was John Quincy Adams. I mean, it's just amazing. Of course, he wrote a biography of his father. He knew Hamilton. He was engaged with that generation, but his careful tracing of the rise of the parties back to the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson on national power and states' rights is so inspiring. And I'm so inspired by the end of that speech on the Jubilee of the Constitution, where Adams says of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that it's so important to study them. He says, take these principles as frontlets between your eyes. He's quoting Deuteronomy. Place them above your doorsteps, your doorposts. Whisper them to your children when they sleep. Make them the principles of your political salvation. So he believes in lifelong learning through deep reading. He reads Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, Jefferson's favorite book in the original, which inspires him to become one of the greatest abolitionists of his time. And he's just incredible. And then the most surprising, I'm not flattering the home crowd too much, but I thought it was pretty impressive that Theodore Roosevelt wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris. Yeah. And it's good. I'm writing about Gouverneur Morris now too, and it's well written and its judgments are strong and just. And he really captures the Federalist mindset beautifully. So, wow, what a reader and writer and historian Theodore Roosevelt was. And it's a side of him that we tend not to think about, overcome by the Rough Rider and the brave survivor of the assassination attempt and the trust buster. But he was a real intellectual. So bully for Theodore Roosevelt.
And we have never said no to playing towards the home crowd here at the TRPO. We appreciate the recognition of his intellectual strain, and you alluded to it in one of your remarks, his list of books that he's read in his correspondence. And this isn't just a man who's retired or has some idle free time. This is the leader of the United States who is reading just a litany of texts in both English and French and engaging deeply with them at conversations at the dinner table when people would maybe perhaps like to talk a little bit lighter fare, but he wants to get into the nuances of the particular arguments of every style of thinker who's lived in history. So yeah, the Rough Rider, the man in front of the bully pulpit with the incredible enunciation, which you did capture well in yours, but also this really deep thinking intellectual. And so let's keep going on this, Governor Morris. We have a question from the chat here. So of course, TR did write this biography of him, which we're happy to hear of your commendation for. So why do you think that this figure, Morris, has faded into relative obscurity compared to Jefferson and Hamilton?
I'm trying to answer that question in my new book, which will be the third book in the Founders Trilogy, The Pursuit of Union. And it's a great question because he was first of all, he's such a vivid, alive, compelling character. We know about his womanizing, and John Jay, after he lost his leg in a carriage accident, famously said, "I wish he'd lost another part of his anatomy." And yet he ends up with a very happy marriage at the end of his life. He writes the preamble to the Constitution and is more responsible for its style than anyone else, according to Madison. He's, along with Wilson, the strongest nationalist at the convention and really defends strong federal power more vigorously than anyone else. He is a heroic ambassador to France during the Revolution, where he writes the best account of the terror and its illiberalism that exists, along with his incredible affairs that he's also recording while he's describing all the bloodshed. He's a magnificent figure. Why is he faded? I think it must be because his outlook is so aristocratic. He openly defended what was called then the aristocracy. Hamilton did too. And if Hamilton had lived, he might have been maybe not forgotten, but even more challenged for similar reasons. Gouverneur Morris was not a fan of unchecked rule by the rich. In fact, he wanted to follow John Adams in ostracizing them or confining them to the Senate, where they could be checked by an independent president and the popular House. But he did think that his own class had the leisure and means to tend to the public interest rather than to the parochial interests of a party. Still, despite his great devotion to union, he betrays his ideals at the end, along with everyone else. And during the War of 1812, he joins the Hartford Convention, which thinks of seceding from the Union, despite his earlier views that secession was unconstitutional. So for all these reasons, I think he may be too European a character to really capture the American imagination. Theodore Roosevelt is such an American through and through, but this cultured, gallant defender of aristocracy who really took life lightly and would write light verse to amuse himself during the ratification debates, was perhaps too brilliant and too exotic to really. It's an interesting question why each of the forgotten founders is forgotten. I'm going to focus in my book on the four founders who spoke most frequently at the Constitutional Convention: Morris, Madison, of course, James Wilson, and Roger Sherman. And aside from Madison, you could say that all three of the others have been forgotten for various reasons. Part of it is just luck. Madison lived long and had a presidency and could write his own history, whereas Morris's political career was less successful, and Wilson died in dreadful circumstances, imprisoned for debt, pursued by a fellow framer for his debts, and he died in a boarding house on the lam from the debt collectors. So, fortune has something to do with it as well. those are some thoughts about Gouverneur Morris.
And when is your book coming out?
I'm just starting this next one, so not too long, but we gotta write it first. So we'll see.
There's a number of questions there about your writing process. Oh my gosh. That. How long does it take you to write a book typically?
Well, these last two books were written pretty quickly, in about 2 years each, a year of reading and a year of writing. And that's partly because I developed this very unusual habit or practice during COVID when I was writing about the pursuit of happiness and the classical moral philosophers who inspired the framers. I followed Jefferson's schedule, where he prescribes getting up 2 hours before dawn, reading moral philosophy, watching the sunrise, and then reading for the next 12 hours, different topics at prescribed times. I only did the morning version. And it was so fulfilling just to get up and read and learn that I was able to write the book also in the morning hours. And I followed a similar practice for Hamilton and Jefferson. And I've become an evangelist for deep reading in the morning. And my new rule is I can't browse until I've read. I've got to read a book before I can browse or surf. Now, I have to confess, the flesh is weak, and I have not recently been keeping up this Stakhanovite schedule, which is one reason that I think the Union book may take a little longer. But if you really set aside time every day, just a little bit every day, I can basically write a book in about 2 years.
Wow, that is admirable. And I'll put in a place that if you want to see a good sunset, or a sunrise rather, I hear there's somewhere in western North Dakota that has a pretty good view.
Wow, it must be amazing.
Nothing to obstruct it. Okay, we have a wonderful variety of questions here, and I think this individual brings up a central contradiction that a lot of people find resonance with when they're thinking about the founding fathers and other, makers of American history. So Jefferson in particular is one of these figures. If we're thinking about Monticello and the celebration of the common life and the farmer and this sort of utopian, idyllic, his romanticization of the early Saxon life. But then there's this very blatant contradiction of the systems upholding that utopian society that he's designing to create. And so in the Founding Fathers, we see these contradictions that can rattle us in some ways, of these figures who are espousing these ideas that are about everything it is to be an American and what it means for America to exist as the democratic nation that it is. But yet there are these undercurrents of values. So how would you engage sort of with these central contradictions in some of these founding father figures?
Well, they're acute, as you suggest, and I do explore them in the Happiness book. To take Jefferson, perhaps the most glaring hypocrisy, he never denied that slavery violated the principles of natural law in the Declaration of Independence, and famously said, "I tremble for my country when I recall that God is just." He had initially tried to justify the revolution with the Saxon myth, this kind of tedious story. But then when King George refused to agree that the colonists had taken from England all of their ancient English liberties, he has to broaden his gaze to the natural rights of all mankind, and writes those, the greatest sentence ever written, as Walter Isaacson has just called it, in the Declaration. And he always says that slavery is immoral. However, he doesn't free his own enslaved population and is constantly shifting the time frame where he expects slavery to end.
Mm-hmm.
And his racism is jarring even by the standards of his time. In the notes on the state of Virginia, he has grotesque passages about African Americans being intellectually inferior, including the great Black poet Phyllis Wheatley, the first published Black poet, who gets a lot of respect from Washington and Franklin, but whom Jefferson demeans, kind of foreshadowing of what would be scientific racism.
Mm-hmm.
He never goes so far as to claim that slavery is a positive good, as the next generation in the antebellum period, like Calhoun, do. And of course, he doesn't dismiss the Declaration as a glittering generality or self-evident lies as the secessionists do, but he is grossly betrays his own principles. Why did he do it? There's an amazing speech where Patrick Henry is just giving the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And then he says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do it the inconvenience of living without it." And that's kind of that moment of candor. I think it's wicked and wrong, but I like the lifestyle and don't want to give it up. I think that was really Jefferson's situation as well.
Mm, wonderful. So now we'll shift a little bit to Hamilton, and readers of the book will find that recurring drum beat, and pun intended there, of Hamilton throughout the text. So I'd be interested in some of your reflections there. How did the musical intersect with your thinking as you were developing the project? And how intentional was it as a sort of contemporary through line for readers as you were crafting the text?
You know, it wasn't really much of a through line. I noted it as the most famous example of how the reputations of Hamilton and Jefferson are deeply dependent on pop culture.
Mhm.
We saw that in the Roosevelt era when that book, The Conqueror by Gertrude Atherton, a kind of fictionalized life of Hamilton, totally makes him go viral and makes his reputation. And that the fact that the Jefferson Hamilton book that FDR loved was such a bestseller really did a lot for Jefferson. And of course, the musical transformed Hamilton from the forgotten monocrat into the rap star of the moment. And of course, I talk about his influence in its time and how Obama relied on him and how he resurrected interest in Hamilton. But aside from one quotation at the beginning of the Hamilton biography chapter, I figured it was better to let Hamilton and Jefferson speak in their own words.
Mhm.
And also, I say at the beginning, I decided not to take sides between Hamilton and Jefferson.
Mhm.
Previous biographers have been just notorious partisans for one or the other. And I thought it'd be more useful to present them in their own words and let readers make up their own mind. Because as it turns out, many of us, or most of us, are drawn to both or a combination of Hamilton and
Mhm.
Jefferson, and only by presenting them honestly and showing the extremely complicated twists and turns in their reputations, I thought could people make an informed decision about who they preferred.
So in that sense, it's a deliberate intervention in what you called out as the pop culture reshaping of these historical figures?
Yes, I mean, I wasn't setting to respond to the musical, but there's no doubt, as Annette Gordon-Reed and others have noted, that the Hamilton of the musical is not the Hamilton of history. It's certainly not the way that he was viewed in his time. And it's good to remember him in all of his complexity. The fact that forgotten aspect of him, like Gouverneur Morris, the
Mhm.
yearning for a kind of for aristocracy, for the British Constitution, and for a king elected for life, has been totally forgotten in the canonization of Hamilton. And it's important to remember it, that it was the main way that his contemporaries thought of him. And even Morris, in his eulogy for Hamilton, said he wasn't sure whether Hamilton was serious in constantly talking about his hobby, which was to mount a horse and lead a filibuster to Spanish Louisiana himself, the very thing that he accused Burr of conspiring to do. So he was a complicated character, and
Mhm.
the complication of history doesn't make for great songs. So you can certainly understand why the musical simplified things. But I find the real Hamilton even more interesting.
Mm. Well, Jeff, if you ever want to write the historically complicated web version of Hamilton's history, you've got a collaborator over here. So just jot that one down.
Well, I have to confess that I not long ago started to compose, and I wrote 2 song cycles about the pursuit of happiness and the Greek gods and goddesses, which we debuted at the American Philosophical Society, which was a total thrill. And I do have it in mind at some point to write a musical of the convention, which would be fun. And I've got the chorus for Gouverneur Morris. That's the only thing I've got so far. So we'll see if Lin-Manuel Miranda, watch out when you see the singing and dancing Roger Sherman and Gouverneur Morris. It's just going to be dynamite.
You had me at chorus for Morris. I'll hype you up to Mr. Miranda any day of the week.
Absolutely.
We'll wrap it up with a few more questions here. One from the audience. If both Hamilton and Jefferson were alive today, which modern political or economic issues would they agree on rather than disagree?
Great question. I mean, there's a question before the Supreme Court about whether or not they would agree about the constitutionality of independent agencies, and the briefs quote them on both sides. And there's an originalist case that Hamilton certainly favored the agencies, and that Jefferson did through Madison, who supported an independent controller of the Treasury. So as usual, history is complicated and you can argue it on either side. The Trump v. US immunity case also quoted Hamilton both for and against broad presidential immunity in Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Sotomayor's dissents. But the one thing we know that they would agree on is the American creed, that we are a creedal nation defined by our allegiance to the ideals of liberty, equality, and government by consent.
Wonderful. So I would like to call out some remarks that I heard in your recent talk at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. You've mentioned in this talk in particular about how it was encouraging that in your travels across America, how people, regardless of where they are in rural America, regardless of their political belief across the spectrum, they are just as ever deeply engaged in history and the origins of our country, and they're united in that belief. And again, I'm really leaning towards a sort of choose your own adventure here. But when I heard you speak of that, I am admittedly a big John Steinbeck fan, and it called to mind Travels with Charlie, wherein he, this great American writer, sets out to rediscover America by traveling across the country and talking with people about their lives. It's one of my absolute favorite books. So as you were traveling and engaging with audiences for this book, did you feel like you were undertaking a similar kind of seismic journey that encapsulated your career? I mean, as the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center and all of your work across journalism at George Washington, it seems like a journey like that really does speak to a lot of the values and ideas that you've spent your life exploring. Could you speak to that journey a little bit?
Well, it was very inspiring, and it was possible because of a generous grant from a foundation to travel around to rural bookstores and talk about history. And it was incredibly inspiring to see what deep readers people are, what patriots they are in red and blue America, and how devoted they are to the principles of the American creed, even though they disagree about how to balance those principles, just as Hamilton and Jefferson themselves did. And the point is that disagreement is not a bug in the system, but it's a feature. And it's the healthy disagreement, the productive tension between Hamilton and Jefferson that has sustained the American idea. One thing that's made it possible to have these inspiring conversations is that I really don't talk about politics. First of all, I've lost interest in my own political opinions. And at the National Constitution Center, I wasn't allowed to have opinions, which is incredibly liberating. And I recommend it for everyone because you really get up every morning with a spring in your step. But people are not going to agree about politics, but they can agree about history and the Constitution, or at least they can productively disagree about it. So just that simple rule about focusing the conversation on history and the Constitution rather than current partisan politics, I think is what frees people up to talk and listen to different points of view and change their minds and be open to learning and growing. Really, what inspired me most was how many lifelong learners there are out there and how many people find deep meaning in reading and creative work and their spiritual lives in prayer, how many set time aside for those activities in a daily way, just as the founders themselves did. And it kind of gives the lie to the idea that all of us are amusing ourselves to death and scrolling ourselves into oblivion. I am concerned about the challenge to reading by screens. I'm a screen addict, I always confess, and it was only that weird COVID reading project that helped me develop the habit of Theodore Roosevelt-like reading. But I do think that deep reading is necessary for the survival of the Republic, and I'm inspired by how many deep readers there are out there, including our hero, TR.
Oh, I don't think we could conclude on a finer note, Mr. Rosen. So thank you so much for your time and expertise. It was wonderful to hear from you, both in your talk and in your thoughtful answers to tonight's questions. Listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend and carry forward some of the questions at the heart of the pursuit of liberty, even if that is just picking up a book and engaging in some deep reading. And if you're thinking about other things to share with a friend or a great place to read a book with wonderful views of the sunrise, tickets are on sale to the TR Library, and we would love to see you out here. So if you would like to learn more about our wonderful virtual programs like tonight's with Mr. Rosen, Theodore Roosevelt, that voracious reader himself, and to start planning your visit to our beautiful space out here at the Badlands, you can visit us at our home on the web at trlibrary.com. Mr. Rosen, it was wonderful to have you, and to everyone who has joined us virtually, we wish you a great night, and we'll see you next time.